such a good turnout. My name is Katie Gibbs. I'm the Executive Director of Evidence for Democracy. We're a new organization that advocates for the use of evidence in government decision making. So following on the success of the Stand Up for Science rallies that we did, as well as a new book that's coming out called The War on Science by Chris Turner, we decided to do a panel discussion to get into these issues in a little bit more detail and start to discuss the health of public interest science, what are some of the problems, and hopefully get into talking about some of the solutions. So we brought together an excellent selection of panelists here today. So we have Dr. Patrick Lafard. He's an associate professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs here at U Ottawa and a member of the university's Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. Next to him, we have Dr. Rhys Casson. He's a professor of biology and the University Chair of the University Research Chair in Experimental Evolution and the former Chair of the Partnership Group for Science and Engineering. Next to him, we have Michael Halpern. He is the Director of Strategy and Innovation at the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists in the US. And next to him, we have Chris Turner, who is an award-winning science and technology journalist and the author of a new book called The War on Science, Muzzled Scientists and Willful Blindness in Stephen Harper's Canada. So we're going to actually start with a short presentation by Chris, sort of introducing the themes of his new book, and then we'll hand things over to Yves Leboutillier, who will lead the panel discussion and introduce the topics that we're going to discuss. Here's Chris.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm actually just going to mount this microphone and then we'll carry on. Maybe. Whenever you do this, you want to do like the roadie thing. You remember the Tom Hanks character on Saturday Night Live who came out as the roadie? Maybe it's just me. So first of all, thanks for coming tonight, and thanks to everyone on the panel for participating. Thanks to Katie and Evidence for Democracy for putting this together, and I'm very excited to be here. Much more so than my previous books, this is a book that is about Ottawa and about the state of affairs up on the Hill. And so it makes sense to be launching the book here tonight. It officially goes on sale tomorrow, but I can tell you they already have copies, obviously here for sale, and down at the chapters on Rideau Street. So it is getting out there and the word is spreading. What I thought I would do off the top is sort of briefly tell you what the book's about, give you kind of an overview, which in turn will introduce the more specific topics that we are discussing as a panel. So to begin with, what is this war on science that I want about in the book? To begin with, I believe that the war on science is basically an outline of what is Stephen Harper's true agenda as Prime Minister of Canada and leader of the government. There's been a lot of talk over the years since this government came to power about what sort of agenda they were exactly getting at, what was their goal. I believe this is absolutely their top priority as a government, which is to dismantle basically the Canadian government's long-standing traditions of scientific research and environmental stewardship, areas until recently where Canada led the world in a lot of categories, particularly the natural sciences, which have been the worst hit. And to do that basically to enable the ease of resource extraction, resource development across the country. Although there was sort of a long prelude to the war on science, I think it kind of began in earnest with the 2011 electoral victory, the majority government that came to power then, and its clearest enunciation was Bill C-38, the Omnibus Budget Bill, in the spring of 2012, which was one of the most extraordinary budget documents this country has ever seen. When C-38 was being tabled, Christopher Plunkett, who is the spokesperson in the United States for the Canadian government, said this about it. Very, very clear enunciation of what I think the agenda is and what's being put forward in the war on science. The idea is simple and straightforward. These are his words. To make Canada the most attractive country in the world for resource investment and development, and enhance our world-class protection of the environment today for future generations of Canadians. This is very typical of the rhetorical style of this government, which is to state up front what you actually care about and then kind of couch it in terms of something that all Canadians agree on that you don't actually believe, which is that the world-class environmental standards are a part of that package. And really what we've seen is the dismantling of that in favor of the most attractive country in the world for resource investment. I believe that this agenda, this war on science, works basically in sort of a three-step process. There have been three sort of main theme categories to how it operates. First, systemically, particularly since the majority government in 2011 came to power, this is a government that has been reducing its own capacity to gather basic data about the status and health of the Canadian environment and Canadian society, particularly in those areas where resource development, lucrative resource development, is anticipated or already underway. That's step one. Step two has been to shrink and eliminate those offices and organizations, both inside and outside government, that monitor and analyze the evidence gathered by basic scientific researchers, and those agencies as well that respond to environmental emergencies. So we begin by reducing the capacity to produce data, period. You add on to that, step two, the ability to analyze that data and respond to it. And as I said, not just within government. One of the other things that this government has done is wage a pretty relentless assault on NGOs, environmental organizations, any group that has been vocal in its opposition to the stuff that had gone down in step one. And then the third step has been seizing control of the communications channels by which all of the above are reporting their findings to government and the Canadian public. And this is, in some ways, the most sort of famous piece of the war on science because it's so unprecedented, this muzzling of government scientists, forbidding them to speak to journalists. In an extreme case at the International Polar Year Conference last year in Montreal, Environment Canada scientists in rooms full of their peers were not permitted to answer questions openly from the audience. Instead, they actually had to redirect questions from the audience to media minders who had been sent by Environment Canada to keep tabs on them. This was without precedent. There was not a single other group of scientists from anywhere in the world at that conference who had that kind of leash attached to them while they were trying to get on with the job of being government scientists. So that is the three-piece war on science. One way to think about it, the famous three monkeys with the hands like this. Do no science, hear no science, speak no science. That's pretty much, particularly in those aspects where the science is really getting in the way of your policy goal. That's the Harper agenda right there. That's the simple fact of it. You don't have to read the tea leaves or try and look through, is he secretly, deeply socially conservative? No, he's deeply, deeply opposed to government getting in the way of the growth of the resource extraction industries. That's job number one. Absolute top priority. They've said it, and it's true, and that's really why we're here tonight, is to discuss what that means for Canada, that this is the nature of their agenda. There's a very famous quote, usually attributed to the U.S. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, that goes, you're entitled to your opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And he said this, of course, or used often during the Bush administration in the United States, where the idea of generating your own reality became part of the way certain kinds of government go about their business. And really, I think that's the nature of this Harper agenda, is they've gone into the dismantling the fact generation business, particularly the part that they control within government. So the places where those pesky facts come from that say, hey, actually, the implications of that policy are pretty grave for the Canadian environment, the Canadian people. Let's just see how much we can do to dismantle that. And I won't go exhaustively into the list of what's been dismantled because we would be here all night, but just, somewhat scattershot what has been lost in the 7 years that this government has been in power. The long-form census, of course, is gone. Its replacement turns out junk statistics for more money. If you read up on that, basically the new National Household Survey is almost totally unusable in some aspects, and it costs more to deliver. We backed out of the Kyoto Accord, it's gone. We did not sign the United Nations Vienna Declaration on HIV and AIDS, which recommended evidence-based drug policy. Many of our traditional allies did sign on to that. We are the only country in the UN to back out of the Convention to Combat Desertification. The Honorable John Baird described it as a talk fest and a waste of time. Every other country in the United Nations does not feel that way. And by the way, it's a line item on the federal government budget so small that the last ad you saw for the Economic Action Plan on Hockey Night in Canada would have covered it. What else is gone? The Canadian Foundation for Climate and Atmospheric Science, gone. The National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy is gone. The Fisheries Act has been dramatically rewritten inside a budget document, which is unprecedented. The Navigable Waters Protection Act rewritten in 2 budget documents, again unprecedented. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans Habitat Management Program has been slashed. 7 of 11 DFO libraries and archives have been closed forever. The National Aboriginal Health Organization is gone. Its funding is gone. The Canadian Women's Health Network funding is gone. Parks Canada this past winter, a number of the parks had to suspend, either close for the winter or rely on volunteers to do things like snow clearance so that people could use the facilities because their budget has been so severely slashed. National Research Council has been massively overhauled. You talk to people at the National Research Council, they describe it almost more like someone picked it up and shook it. And this has been, and just left chaos behind, and this has been in order to, as the current director says, turn it into a concierge for industry. So you imagine, the grand tradition of the National Research Council now reduced to, the equivalent of getting theater tickets for people who are in town for a few days, concierge to industry. Now, as I said, any number of these, and I haven't done all the math, but maybe all of them, probably could be funded by the $113 million that this government has spent since 2009 to cement the phrase economic action plan into all of our heads. $113 million, that's what that's cost so far, by conservative estimates, actually. So, and that really gets to the core of this. The Harper agenda is a sort of bet. If we keep saying over and over that you should be thankful that we are doing such a great job with the economy, you would be just in such dire straits. This would be a disaster if anyone else had their hand on this tiller. Please don't pay attention to what we're doing when we do it. Just ignore it, keep watching the hockey. We'll tell you between periods every time how things are going. We've got a great little jingle, some beautiful, beautiful scenes for you to look at as we tell you how good things are going. And it kind of gets to the core of the ideology behind it. And it's not, to my mind, a particularly grandiose, high-minded ideology. And say what you want about the kind of chaos that's going on in the United States government right now, at least there's a pretty big, if crazy, idea behind it. There's not really a big idea behind what we're seeing with this government. It's in fact more of, actually one of the people who I spoke to from the National Research Council anonymously, I thought he put it best. I think he got to the essence of this war on science and the agenda that's behind it. And what he said was, it feels like we're being run by small-town hardware merchants who are not willing to invest in anything if it's not going to pay off in the next 6 months. Cash on the barrel. How do we make money now? What businesses are doing well? Let's help them. Everything else is incidental. Let's just, really, really focus on how healthy next month and the month after that. You imagine this small-town hardware merchant. I don't care how all this stuff works. I don't care how you make it. I don't want to hear about some next-generation technology. What I want to know is what's going to sell next season. How many lawnmowers should I be ordering for the spring rush? That sort of thing. And what this does, this not only does the damage that we're seeing to the natural sciences, to environmental stewardship and monitoring, the rest of it, but it actually fundamentally misunderstands, first of all, what government is for, and second of all, what it does well. And what government is for, or should be for, is the public interest, the commonweal, protecting the common good. Private interests are very, very good at looking after their own economic health. That's what they do. The government is not supposed to be supporting the one or the other. It's supposed to be guarding over the commonweal in all of those things. So first of all, it is a very, very different way of thinking about what government is for. Second of all, is it really does misunderstand how these agencies function. And I'm going to give you a very concrete example of the National Research Council, one of the great sort of success stories of the National Research Council. And think whether a concierge service to current industry would have come up with this idea. Because this is the kind of thing, the kind of business economic generation the NRC does very, very well. It's the kind of thing where what the result of it, the companies that resulted, would be the kind of ones that the MPs would want to stand in front of for the photo op during the election campaign and say, hey, look at this great stuff we're doing, we should keep doing more of it. And it begins in the early 1970s with a guy by the name of Bill Buxton, self-professed hippie at the time, who was studying at Queen's University, liked to ride his motorcycle, and was very into music. And one of his professors said, oh, the National Research Council, they've got this crazy new electronic music machine that you should go check out. And so Bill Buxton, got some grants obviously to go look at this crazy electronic music machine. And the things that actually really excited him wound up not being the music, but some of the interface and the way the computer and the different tools worked together. Among other things, at the time, the National Research Council had an early prototype of what became the computer mouse, and that was one of the things that you used to program the music in this electronic music machine. And so Buxton got to playing around with it and started to figure out other things it could do, and then started working with some other people and eventually found some industry partners, and went on to found two of the companies that created Canada's 3D graphics industry, Alias Wavefront and SGI, two of the now giant companies. They've won Oscars for their work in 3D animation. They are giants of Hollywood. And that is exactly the kind of success story that no concierge service to current industry ever would have funded. And again, this I think gets to the fact that the hardware merchants do not understand the nature of the thing that they are ruining. David Schindler, the great aquatic researcher who founded the Experimental Lakes area, which is another thing that's now gone from the federal budget, likes to say the kindest thing I can say about them is they don't understand the science they're ruining. And I think that gets to the essence of it. If this agenda succeeds, I firmly believe the result is a greatly diminished country, a diminished Canada, a country afraid of open-ended questions and afraid of speculative science, addicted to a shallow prosperity, and far out of step with its traditional allies, in particular on the 21st century's defining issue, which is climate change and how we reconcile our needs for energy with the scale of that problem. We are completely out of step, basically, with the entirety of the free world on that one now. And we see that time and again now. Anytime Canadian government officials go anywhere to try and talk about climate and energy, they are roundly discredited by most of the audiences they speak to. I think we'll spend the rest of the evening hopefully making the case that this is a pretty urgent matter, that this is something that definitely should be on the national agenda. I will say to you, if we've convinced you by the end of it, that there are three things, obviously, that you can do. And, it's nice to know as a democratic citizen there are things you can do. First of all, of course, you buy my book and read about it and you get to know all that. Second of all is write to your MP and express your dissatisfaction. It sounds almost trivial, but it does actually matter. Those letters get opened and read. And also write into media outlets who aren't covering this and say that they should be paying more attention to it. And then the third thing I would say is get directly involved. Katie Gibbs can tell you how to get involved through Evidence for Democracy. There are a number of other organizations springing up to take this stuff into account. There's also, of course, going to be another federal election eventually, and one of the most powerful things you can do as a democratic citizen is to volunteer in a campaign, particularly one for a party that states that it intends to restore our grand internationally recognized tradition of basic government science and environmental stewardship. Both of those things have been ruined by this government, and I hope to tell you a little bit more about how we're going to do that in the evening to come. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that fast and furious introduction into the issues. I'd like to also mention that I encourage you to tweet during the event using the hashtag Science Matters. We're also live streaming this, so there's people watching from all over the country, so you can kind of join in that fun on Twitter. And now I'm going to pass it over to our moderator, Yves Leboutillier. Yves teaches international law here at U Ottawa and is currently the director of the IUCN Academy of Environment Law.
Researchers, things like Christy Miller, who wrote a report for the journal Science on the salmon fishery on the West Coast, and then was basically the press release that was prepared for it was deleted, just thrown out, and she was told she would not be permitted to answer any of the media requests, and there were many. It was a report of international import, and technically speaking, this doesn't break any rules. This is, civil servants do serve the government in power. They are not supposed to be voices on matters of public policy. They're simply supposed to enforce and support the policy that's in place. That said, by tradition, as long as we've employed government scientists, they have been free to speak about what their work is and talk to other scientists about it and talk to the media about what it means and a little bit about the implications, as long as, as much as possible, don't get into don't get us into hot water by talking too much about the current government's policy. And that is what's been breached. And I would argue, basically that it fundamentally breaches something that goes beyond Canadian government policy to the kind of essence of what science is and the scientific method is. I mean, if scientists can't talk to each other, can't review each other's work, can't disseminate it freely to people who are interested in it, then it's not really science in the Enlightenment tradition. And so I think that's really the core of it. Obviously, there have always been certain restrictions on how political you can get as someone on the public payroll. But the idea that you would be able to just intervene anytime the science is inconvenient and say, no, you can't talk to your peers about this, you can't talk to the media about this, I think violates a spirit of Canadian governance that has never been violated before. And it's like a lot of the things I think that this government does, that it's been, a lot of Canadian democracy and Canadian freedom is really built on these sort of unstated traditions. There's not as much kind of check and balance stuff as there is in certain other democracies, and this has really been the kind of breach that this government has specialized in, is just throwing out anything, no matter how long the tradition and how valued the result, if it's inconvenient for them. And just as a final note, I would say, up until this Conservative government came to power, it was, as a matter of course, most government departments strongly encouraged scientists to talk to the media and talk to the public, because it was considered a really good PR move to be able to tell the Canadian public, hey, here's what we're doing with all the money you give us. Here's all this great stuff that we're producing. Look at us, we've got world-class scientists doing amazing stuff for the public interest here. And so it was considered a matter of pride, and now is considered, of course, an inconvenience that gets in the way of certain kind of policy. So I do think we've entered a very different sort of era, even though, to the letter, it doesn't necessarily violate any contract or anything like that.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. So we'll go to Michael Lockburn, who remember Program Manager to the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists in Washington, D.C. Michael?
Thanks for having me here. And I'm actually not here to convince you of anything. I'm just kind of here to share the U.S. experience. I'm sure that you have had enough of people from the U.S. telling you what to do. It's actually kind of refreshing to be here in some ways, because of the fact that it's usually my Canadian friends who come to me and say, what are you doing down there? And now I can return the favor. I worked at the Union of Concerned Scientists. We've been around about 45 years. Started working on nuclear issues a long time ago. I've worked with our Center for Science and Democracy, before that our Scientific Integrity Program that was started during the Bush administration, when there were people that were very concerned that the Bush administration was politicizing science in a way that had never been seen before. Now, it's important to note that all politicians politicize science in some way. And in the US, we had President Clinton going against the science on needle exchange programs. So we have these sorts of examples of political interference in science on a lot of different topics by all administrations. The Bush administration took it to another level, and from what I've read, that's what's happening here in Canada. I sort of would describe it that Canadian scientists are in a place where US scientists were about a decade ago, trying to figure out how to operate, how to work, how to get research out, how to thrive in an environment where the government is more concerned about message control than a more deliberative discussion of the facts. But we have to discuss what this is. What are we talking about? We're not talking about policy decisions per se. We're not talking about moral questions, such as whether it's ethical to do stem cell research. We're talking about the ability of scientists to do research, to ask contentious questions, to share information, and to be able to inform the policy making that happens. I do really think that it's important to make this sort of distinction, and really not to talk about science and policy in the same breath. And doing so really, you do so at your peril, because of the fact that the responses that you will get when you talk about the control on government scientist speech is, well, you're just upset with the policies that we're putting forward. This has nothing to do with the science. There's a lot of non sequitur responses that come when people start talking about scientific integrity in government. It's a complex topic. It's difficult for people to get their head around. You really have to define it well and be cautious and contentious about, or non-contentious about how you describe it. So what restrictions should be put on government scientists? Scientists should not be given completely full reign on what they should talk about. They have rights and responsibilities. So scientists have the right to ask tough research questions, to go where the research points them. They should have the ability to collect sufficient data that allows them to do that research, to pursue those questions. They should communicate the results and analysis and not feel like they will face retribution if they share it with the public or with the press or with policymakers. They should be able to speak as private citizens. They don't check their citizenship rights at the door when they go into work for a federal agency or federal entity. They can have their own personal opinions. What should they not do? Clearly, don't release any sort of proprietary information or information that's protected from release by law. They shouldn't always say that they are speaking for the government or imply that as an Environment Canada scientist, that their scientific opinion should carry all weight. And they shouldn't be unclear. Well, what do I mean by being unclear? Scientists should think about what they are representing when they do speak and when they do share information. So there's three sort of buckets that we can think about when scientists are sharing information. There's, this is my data. This is the information that I produce. That's bucket number one. There's, this is my interpretation of the data. This is, as a scientist, this is what I think this data means. That's bucket number two. And then bucket number three is, based on my informed opinion, my interpretation of the data, I think we should move forward with in this direction or with this policy. And as long as the scientist is clear on which bucket they're speaking from and which area they're representing, it eliminates a lot of confusion and it builds a lot of trust. There's also the clarity of whether or not scientists are speaking as a person or as a representative of government. It's important to make that distinction so that people, so that journalists, so that people who are in the audience can understand where they're coming from. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Reese Casson, Professor of Biology and University Research Chair in Experimental Evolution, University of Ottawa. Reese.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much to Katie and the Evidence for Democracy for inviting me and to my co-panelists. I have the unique position of being the only scientist on this panel, which is good. And furthermore, I'm not a government scientist. I am paid ultimately through the public purse, right? I mean, our tax dollars go to supporting my research program, and I'm a university professor, so you know. But I have, so I speak for myself. I'm not speaking on behalf of any organization. I'd also like to just clarify that one of the reasons I think I was invited, although this was never explicitly stated, was that I spent 3 years chairing this organization called the Partnership Group for Science and Engineering. I'll just give you a brief introduction to what that organization is and does, because it's a rather quiet group in Canadian science policy landscape. The Partnership Group, or PAGSI, or sometimes PAGES, is a coalition of professional societies in science and engineering that represents and speaks on behalf of the research community primarily to the federal government. Now, I want to be clear that they're speaking on behalf of that community and with the idea of working on behalf of Canadians, but they are not a lobby group. There are a couple people in the audience I know who will take me to task on that, but we'll leave that for the moment. They're not a lobby group in a couple of senses. One is they're not registered as a lobby group. Second of all, they are very careful that when they speak to government to not advocate on behalf of any particular organization or individual or even discipline. What they try and do is just say, look, we're surveying the landscape, this is the opinion of this community, and when it comes time to making decisions, we think that you should keep these ideas in mind. So I chaired that group for 3 years. It's not a very public organization. It works quietly behind the scenes. So I think that's one of the other reasons I'm On the topic at hand of communications and government scientists and communicating, to me, it's actually very clear, and I very much appreciated Michael's comments about the 3 buckets. I think that very many times scientists themselves don't know about those buckets, and they end up in scientific conferences overstating many of the implications, policy implications of their own work. So that's a caution. To me, in terms of government science, it seems perfectly reasonable that scientists working on scientific issues should have the ability to talk about their science with other scientists and potentially with the community at large. That's part of what we do. We're working to build a pool of public knowledge, if you like. And some of that knowledge is more directed to certain endpoints than others, but they should have the ability to do that. And I am perfectly okay with a government scientist not being able to speak on policy issues. That's fine. That's part of the job that they're hired to do. It's part of their oath as a public servant, that when it comes to the matters of policy, they are there to serve the government as the elected representatives of Canadians, in this case, or any other government. So that's really all I have to say. I have no problem with it, and I do think it is a problem, however, when in a research setting, where there's a free exchange of ideas, what Bruno Latour liked to call the parliament of ideas, that not everybody can participate. I think that's a problem.
Thank you. So, and then Patrick Papar, Associate Professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs and the Faculty of Social Science, University of Ottawa.
Thank you. Let me take issue a little bit and explain why I'm here, I guess. You may actually not be the only scientist, in the sense that I come from a discipline called political science. So I'm a social scientist, so take that for what it's worth. But I guess dark art, yes. The other reason that I'm here is that I suspect if I'm not the only member of the panel who's served in government, I'm probably the one who served the longest and the most senior levels. And my last job in Privy Council office, I actually led a team of social scientists, PhDs in economics, political science, sociology. And so some of the issues we've been talking about, I'm familiar from that side. So let me make a couple of quick points. One, I just want to echo this idea that there is a question of loyalty. That government scientists are not like university scientists. They swear an oath. And that third bucket that you described is actually probably the one that the trickiest one of all, and to divorce the dividing line between the science and the implications for policy. The second thing I would say is, again, very quickly, is that the current government, and maybe I should have led with this, the current government's approach is extraordinarily different. There has been a substantive change in the way in which the government goes about communicating. But at its core, there is a basic idea that sort of makes sense when you think about it. Well, who is going to speak for the government? Who will be the person who is identified as articulating what the government view is? And that matters because one of the challenges scientists who work for the government have when they engage with media is that the media are quick to find a gap, if there is one, between what the government's policy is and what the science might suggest. And if there is a gap, then the scientist is put in this very awkward spot of trying to explain or comment on that gap, which is they probably shouldn't be doing and are in a very difficult spot. So the government, not unreasonably, seeks to avoid that situation in the first place. But the most important thing that I want to bring to this conversation is the problem of the muzzling of scientists. We're looking at it through only the one lens called science. What we're looking at here is a phenomenon that goes well beyond the speech by government scientists. The phenomenon we are witnessing, where scientists are allegedly being muzzled, is a function of the broader communication strategy of the government. This government, for good or for ill, taking its page in some extent from what goes on in the United States, has essentially adopted the view that it's engaged in a permanent election campaign, and that it is absolutely preoccupied with its messaging, and it wants to be absolutely clear who speaks for the government, and it wants no ambiguity in the public mind as to what the government thinks about issues. And so it seeks to control the message in a way that we've never actually encountered before. And that is new, but that's not unique or restricted to speech by government scientists. That's something that public servants in the broader sense are subject to. And so we got a whiff of this earlier this year when Library and Archives Canada released a protocol as to how its staff should communicate. And it was the most risk-averse, the Government of Canada is the most risk-averse organization I've ever known. I mean, I worked for provincial governments and we were like anarchy compared to the Government of Canada. But that was taken to a whole new level to the point where, basically public servants were being counseled, don't speak to anybody about anything. And I'm exaggerating, but only a little bit. But again, it's consistent with the government's overall view of how to manage both this broader communication. So, if the war on science becomes deemed to be the equivalent of the muzzling issue, and there are several issues that we need to talk about today, and we will, but the muzzling issue should not be understood as being uniquely about science. It's a much more broad phenomenon, number one. And number two, there are, in its core, some good reasons why you would want to be very careful in how you regulate or not regulate what scientists who work for the government do and do not say.
Well, thank you very much. So we're going to go around again and ask for reaction from the panelists, from what they heard from the others. But maybe we can start with Chris, and also I can ask at the same time a question. That is, to what extent has this government, federal government, gone beyond the restrictions that have been suggested by Michael Alpern? To what extent this government has gone beyond the restrictions suggested by Michael Alpern in regard to scientists?
Right, and I do think it is, I agree it's important to put it in context, that we are talking about a government that not just has told certain scientists that they can't speak to the media about the science they've done for policy reasons or for strategic reasons, but that they do in fact, the command and control of all messaging is without precedent. There are really, really good political reasons to do that. It is an extraordinarily effective electoral strategy, as we've seen with this government. If you want to, shape the image of your government as carefully as possible, you reduce the number of messages and you reduce the number of voices. I mean, there's a practical reason to do it. I strongly disagree with it, but there is a practical reason to do it. And I think that's where probably that line gets breached. They aren't just telling scientists and other civil servants who are, in the third bucket, so to speak, hey, don't talk about policy implications. Talk about your science, talk about what it means to other scientists and your analytical conclusions, the kind of stuff you would put in a peer-reviewed journal. Don't talk about policy implications. That's not the only thing they are limiting. They are going past that to saying your message and the science it represents must remain consistent with our policy goals and our electoral goals. And that is the measure we are using. We are not judging it on the quality of the science or how it impacts policy. We are judging it on whether or not it is good for us politically. And I think that, to my mind, is the really big line that this government has crossed in taking the civil service, which is paid, is part of the government of Canada, part of this thing that exists regardless of which master it serves, and putting it basically in the business of shaping political messages that are favorable to the current government. And you can see this, by the way, just to give a kind of a really concrete example. If you pay close attention to the Economic Action Plan ads, they're very well made ads. I mean, there's a lot of time, money, and effort went into making them quite look good. There's, like the radio jingle has got like a little kind of jaunty bar from Canada at the end of it that makes you feel good about it all. There's almost zero content, though. That is not the Conservative Party of Canada paying for a political message. That is Canadian taxpayers paying for what essentially amounts to propaganda on the part of the Conservative Party. Because it says almost nothing. The reason that money exists in the public purse is to tell Canadians what their government is doing, how they can access certain programs, that sort of thing. Generally informing the public about what's going on in Canada, that sort of thing. Not making it seem like we're doing a really good job on the economy, which is the main thing that those ads are doing. They're almost totally content free. They kind of gesture at various websites that might tell you a little bit about what the government's up to. And I think that's the line that's crossed, and I think a different kind of government asking a few scientists to maybe keep a lid on it might not have attracted this much censure.
Thanks, Chris. So who wants to pick up maybe, anybody wants to comment? Patrick?
Michael Halpern made the suggestion that perhaps we should try and aspire to drawing a sharp distinction between the science and the policy. And in my experience, that line is actually incredibly hard to draw, number one. And number two, in the media universe in which we now live, I think it's getting increasingly difficult to draw. And so I'm sort of not sure that when a scientist who's in the employ of government goes into the public square, he or she will actually be allowed or given free rein to keep a hard and fast distinction. So it may be, it's easy to say, but I suspect it might be actually harder to do. But the other question that I wanted to throw out for people's discussion is this other notion that scientists should be able to communicate freely. Well, if that's in the traditional form of peer-reviewed journals, I think we could all on this panel agree that that is sort of a sine qua non. The part that I'm less sure about is this idea that scientists have should have a right and maybe indeed have a responsibility to engage in communication with the general public. And that idea I'm not so convinced of. But you read stuff about, well, it's government science, we're taxpayers, we pay for it, we should have access to it. And I guess my response is, if life were so simple, there are, as some have already been mentioned, laws about privacy and freedom of information or lack thereof. If you're a defense scientist, probably you don't get to speak very publicly very often. So I want to challenge this idea that government science is by definition public science. I'm not sure it's quite as simple as that.
Thanks, Patrick. Bruce, you want to go, or Michael?
I'll finish up that. Let me maybe muddy the water some more. I think that, so speaking as a non-government scientist, I mean, one makes choices when one goes into science. Sometimes those choices are your own personal choices to make, and sometimes they are thrust upon you. I've been fortunate enough to be able to make a choice to decide one way or the other. I enjoy my freedom in the university. And I think that science as a whole, and I feel that scientists as a whole have done an extremely poor job. And I'm not talking just about responding to your issue about being able to speak freely and engagement with the broader community. The scientists as a whole have done a very poor job of engaging more broadly with the community. And that's part of the root cause, in my view, of this whole discussion. The broader public, who are not themselves scientists, tend not to pay attention much to science unless they have an interest in it. And scientists then come away saying, well, why don't you pay attention to us? Because they're not interested. And I think scientists could do more to do that. Now, is it the role of a government scientist? How far can they go? I think you raised some excellent points, Patrick, about the nature of the material that they're working on. However, at least within the context of, say, international conference, where there is meant to be free and open discussion about issues, that has to be true. Otherwise, the progress of knowledge can't go ahead. When it comes to dealing with the media and the press, I can see that there are sensitivities, but part of this is a practical issue. I mean, if a scientist can't talk to the media, as we saw recently, I think it was in Chris, one of your pieces in the Walrus, where you mentioned this issue of the NRC NASA collaboration. Journalist comes and wants to talk to the NRC about this Canadian contribution to this project, can't do it, and goes to NASA, and of course, bing, 20 minutes. Got his answer. Well, we're left out of the conversation. I think that hurts us as a country, and it hurts the science.
Well, actually, just to briefly interject to be clear about that one, this was, some of you may be familiar with it, but I'll just give you the background. This was an Ottawa citizen journalist. It was a joint study, NRC, Canadian Space Agency, and NASA, looking at the kind of causes of snowfall, volume of snowfall, that kind of stuff. As Canadian a topic as you can get. Curves on hockey sticks might be the only thing more Canadian to study as a scientist. And so the journalist sends this email. They eventually used the Freedom of Information request to get the entire communication around it and how that message was received. And the reason I'm mentioning this is just because I think it speaks to the climate or the kind of culture of government that is created well beyond specific scientists who are told they can't talk. The NRC's communications staff characterizes messages or requests when they come in. This one was characterized as positive/informative, which is to say there's nothing controversial in it, nothing bearing on immediate policy implications, nothing that's going to get us in hot water, makes us look good, and it's about just informing the general public. And then it bounced around for most of a day, well past the journalist deadline, while messages were massaged, while there were internal discussions about whether an interview was necessary, et cetera, et cetera. They eventually exercised extreme caution, did not grant an interview, and did not deliver the information in time to be in the piece. And I think that speaks to the fact that you now have a civil service generally that is probably much more fearful than is good for the health of the country, that jobs get lost if you speak out of turn.
And we got the information from the U.S., so it's only proper to give the last word to our U.S. Colleague here, Michael.
Great. Well, I do agree that scientists do need to do a better job of communicating. Part of the challenge is that it's not part of a scientist training, and there is no reward in terms of the tenure system for writing a letter to the editor, or doing an interview with the Globe and Mail, or addressing a community group about the issue that you're working on. We're sitting on a panel. So he could be really furthering his career right now. All the rest of us are just talking heads. The thing I want to bring up is that people and the public are going to be talking about these scientific issues. And it makes sense to me that the scientists who produce the research and who are the ones who are the experts should be engaged in that conversation. It's a muddy issue. It's difficult to draw those lines, but to tell a scientist that he should or she should disengage does the public a disservice and creates a much less robust conversation. I do also believe and completely agree with Patrick that scientists aren't being singled out here. That this is a government philosophy where centralization of power and centralization of message is really, really important. It's the same thing that we saw during the Bush administration in the U.S., and it was something that would have made scientists very frustrated. Scientists are generally very cautious by nature in terms of communication as well, though. If I bring a scientist to Washington, D.C. to talk about endangered species with Congress, and I say, okay, we're going to go in and talk about the blue butterfly, she might say, well, which kind of blue butterfly? Because I'm only an expert in one specific type of reproduction in this one particular species. I can't talk about those other species of blue butterfly. Well, the scientists are going to be cautious. They're going to be, they're not going to get close to that line where they may speak and say something that they don't agree with in general. So it's kind of important to know the nature of scientists as well as we're having this conversation. One more final point. The message control comes in some ways that the government can direct a reporter or a member of the public towards a scientist that they prefer on an issue where the science isn't settled. In the U.S., several years ago, when there was less robust understanding of the impact of climate change on hurricanes, there were some scientists within government who thought that there may be a link, and some scientists thought that there wasn't anything that was proven. And when there was more message control put in, the media minders within the Bush administration would be pushing people towards the scientists who would say, absolutely, there's not enough evidence there, we don't know anything, and away from the scientists who would say, no, there's controversy here, and the science isn't settled, and we haven't figured this out yet. And so those are the sorts of subtle ways that we can not have access to what scientists are currently discussing in debate.
Thank you, Michael. So this is the final point on this question on the part of the panel, but there will be opportunities for questions at the end of the session.
I want to start by taking issue with the way this particular issue is characterized in Chris Turner's book, which I recommend to you all. It's very entertaining. It's a good rant. It's sort of entertainingly written, but it gets kind of fuzzy on the details. So, if Chris Turner's book is to be believed, the issue of commercialization, if it didn't begin with Stephen Harper, it got much worse with the arrival of the Harper government. And I take issue with that claim. My reading of the evidence suggests that, in fact, the trend to for governments across the OECD to emphasize use of its science spending for commercialization purposes is a long-term trend that goes back in Canada at least to the 90s, if not before, and in fact goes back to much of what was done in the Chrétien government and before that as well. So it's not as if, before Harper we had all things were fine and nice, and then boom, we got a conservative government and we got onto this commercialization trend. The second thing I'd say is one of the things that happened in the 90s was we had, some of you who are my age and older will remember the words program review. Ottawa was shaken, provinces more, but we won't get into that, by the desire of the government of the day to cut back on expenditure, and the trend to cutting back on government science began in earnest 20 years ago, or 15 years ago. So in that sense, the trends we're talking about this evening are by no means new. Now, where should science, or the question talks about a pipeline. But I want to make no mistake, I'm not here to be a defender of the current government, but one thing that is important to observe is that beginning in about 3, 4, 5, after we came out of recession, the Liberal government, and continued by the current Conservative government, put significant new dollars into science. The difference was, it didn't go into government labs, it went in big chunks of money to universities. We got things like Genome Canada, large amounts of money. We got things like InfoWay in the health sector. Now, you can argue that's a good thing, that's a bad thing, but it's very much the case that the government was investing in science in a pretty serious way. The question then becomes, what was being done back in government? And yes, there was a certain amount of even more emphasis on commercialization. But here, and it's the second thing I take issue in the book, is this debate of, is science in the public interest? It is the case that for most of the 20th century, or at least the later 20th century, as governments ramped up their science capability, a lot of it was for environmental protection and health protection. Government got in the business of learning how to protect Canadians and indeed citizens of other countries against various environmental and health risks. And we spent a lot of money in support of that regulatory function. And the public interest, when it comes to government science, became associated, perhaps correctly, with that environmental protection, health protection kind of role. But make no mistake, for a couple of generations, governments have also been investing their science dollars to support economic and industrial development. This is not new. So, I mean, we talk about, and Chris is right, the current government is deeply preoccupied and interested in resource development, particularly in the oil sands. But the NRC lab that does oil sands research in Alberta pre-exists the current government. It's been there a long time. Liberal governments were interested in doing much the same thing. And so this idea that somehow it's new is, I think, wrong. But second, you can argue, we in this room may actually disagree with one another on the right emphasis, but promoting resource development and economic growth is in the public interest. What we're dealing with now is a government that actually has shifted the balance. Its definition of the public interest is way more into the realm of resource development, and potentially, although I think the evidence is ambiguous, less on health protection, and I mean, Chris made the argument on the environmental side. But I think it would be a mistake to say the government is not pursuing the public interest. It is, but it's pursuing a definition of the public interest that maybe some of us don't agree with. But it's not, there are large groups of people for whom this is a very honorable and desirable thing for government to be doing in general, and for using its science dollars to pursue.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Patrick has had an advantage on all of us. He was clever. He ordered Chris' book on Amazon for the official launch. So now, so we have to keep that in mind as we continue.
I have to say that I asked Katie when she asked me to be on the panel if I could get an advance copy of the book, and I never got a response on that. I should have been more
Amazon. One word, Amazon.
I want to echo some of what Patrick said and add a few other reflections. One is that I think governments, for almost the history of science, have been interested in a form of economic development with the science. I mean, this is not just new. It's not only not new in the past 15 or 20 years. It probably dates back to the 19th century, right? We think of Maxwell and electricity and so on. So there is this notion, and I'm in a community of scientists, certainly in this country and around the world, that really is very far removed most of the time from economic outlook. I'm an evolutionary biologist. No, I don't study dinosaurs. That's maybe even further away from what I do. I use microbes. If you like, I sometimes like to say I play God, but I'm worried that Twitter's going to go nuts over that. But I watch the evolutionary process happening in the laboratory because we use things that are very small that divide very quickly. We can see it happening. So, and the questions I'm interested in are things like, how does diversity evolve? And where does it come from? Where does it go? There's not an obvious economic endpoint to this. This is basic science. And my community comes under fire from time to time, my research community, because it's pretty clear that most of us are studying things that are pretty far removed from what might be in the public interest, beyond just public knowledge generation. And so they are very sensitive whenever there's a government decision that says, we're going to take some of this money for research and put it towards economic development, towards, for example, promoting the auto industry in Southern Ontario, as opposed and taking it away from what they perceive as basic research. So I don't have any problem with governments trying to encourage economic development. That in itself is a part of the public good for the country. We need those products to come out. But we also do need, and I will put in an argument for protecting basic research. And I think that there is a very strong argument. One is that this is research that the market won't do otherwise, right? I mean, this is, whether it's environmental protection, whether it's health, whether it's curiosity. And curiosity, as probably most people in this room will be aware, that through these sort of happenstance and circumstantial discoveries, and over longer periods of time that are very much beyond the realm of a typical election cycle, and to be frank, which happen to coincide fairly closely with granting cycles, by the way. These discoveries do get picked up and translated into novel ideas, innovations, and productivity for companies and the country. So that's important. We need to create new knowledge, and basic research is the primary way we go about doing that. We also need to train knowledgeable people, and that's another reason why we need to support basic research. The new economies of the 21st century are going to be knowledge economies. Eventually, our resources will run out. It may be a very long time from now, but we have to be mindful of that and push and be providing at least a supply of individuals who can take advantage of that. And the third is this idea that basic research is the ultimate engine of innovation. Call it a pipeline, call it a pyramid with new ideas coming in from the base and eventually being winnowed out. Some people, I mean, there are metaphors coming out of your ears on what this might best be called. But it is important. And it's not a linear model all the time. It's not like an idea starts here in basic research and gets directly translated and transmuted into an innovation and then a product. It's much more complicated than that, as life is much more complicated. But it is important and it is necessary. So we need to protect basic research. I think the discussion that needs to happen is, where is the right balance? What is the proportion of funding that should go to supporting fundamental curiosity-driven research, and what should support innovation and more economic development research? And I'll just end by saying I think that governments do have a role in supporting all aspects of that. And I think that I would like to see, personally, some new directions, and because it's, frankly, the business community could potentially do a lot more research and development in this country, and they are not doing it. It's not the fault of scientists. It's a business end problem. And so I'll end with that. We can talk about details later.
Thank you very much. So, Michael, maybe you can tell us what is the trend in the U.S. in terms of resource allocation for science? Which way is it going?
Well, right now we don't have much of anything. No, I mean it is. We laugh at it, and it is ridiculous, but it is a big problem. Just a couple of days ago, the Antarctic Research Station that we have down there announced that it's pulling out for the season. It's a short season. That means the entire year of data is going to be lost. These are long-term research projects. So in some cases, it's 2 years of data that's being lost because they're collection over the course of a 2-season period. So right now, there are significant research projects and significant data streams that are being lost forever because there are not scientists on the job because they were deemed non-essential, and it's a big problem. But that's not what we're here to talk about, is it? How many scientists do we have in the audience here? Okay, so it looks like about half. About half. How many other biodiversity specialists do we have? Okay, it's about, I see about 6 or 7 hands going up. Those of you who are will probably know that a good percentage of the prescription drugs that we take that make us better, that prolong our lives, are derived from biodiversity or derived from natural products. They're not synthetic. They come from microbes, they come from other things, and by destroying biodiversity, you destroy the future potential that we have to use this biodiversity for our benefit. That's another reason why basic research should be funded and should be taken into effect. In the U.S., it's quite easy for members of Congress to pick individual grants out and attack them. We talk about shrimp running on treadmills, and we talk about a lot of other things that sound crazy, but have, when you look at it, when the scientist explains what the actual application could be, it actually makes a ton of sense. And so, yes, shame on the politician who exploits the research project and pretends like they're being a good steward of the tax dollars. But the scientists also, need to step up and do a good job of explaining why their research could be important and where it might be going. So we have that challenge. That challenge will always be the case in the U.S. I'm sure there's politicians here who would love to make fun of individual research projects as well. What the government needs to do and needs to make sure that it takes care of is creating basic base level data sets so that we can do research from and do analysis from those data sets. And I think that is one of the things, that's one of the building blocks that I think makes a lot of sense from the book, from what I've heard about it, is that we need to fund that sort of basic data collection and monitoring so that we can find out more about what's happening in the world around us. It's really difficult to talk about reducing air pollution if you have no idea how much pollution is in the air. And then another discussion that's really important that I don't think we have time for, and that I don't have all the answers for either, is how much of the science that is government funded should be in the public domain, and in what time frame, and under what conditions. That is something that goes back and forth in the scientific community, and there are a lot of legitimate arguments about why information shouldn't be made immediately available. You should be able to publish your papers, and you should be able to retain the rights to your intellectual property in some ways, but it is government funded, and people do have the right to collaborate and have an open environment. So those are tough questions as well. What I don't want to get into, and what we have tried very hard not to do in the United States in terms of discussing the role of science in government, is to talk about just base funding levels. It's the prerogative of any administration to decide how much money it wants to send towards investment in science. When we were talking about political interference in science in the United States, and we were trying to talk about the censorship of scientists and the stacking of advisory committees and other ways of polluting the scientific process, the arguments that came back were either you're just upset with their policies or you just want more money. And so in this case, it was not about wanting more money. It was about wanting to respect the integrity of the scientific process. And we needed to keep those things distinct and to really show people what the benefits of research were.
Thank you. So let's round up this question with Chris, and then we'll come back to
Yeah, there was a tremendous amount there to try and condense into my 5 minutes. First of all, I'm absolutely guilty as charged. I strive to be an entertaining ranter. Come from a big Scottish Catholic family in Nova Scotia, and the only way you got listened to is if you were a really entertaining ranter. But to come back to the question, I don't think I necessarily, I mean, there's an emphasis in the book, but in the book, which a lot of you probably haven't had a chance to read because it isn't out yet, or wasn't until today, the book does talk about that none of this is new in and of itself, but the overall emphasis and pattern is extraordinary and unprecedented. And so one of the things I talk about, just to take it all the way back, is basically that if you look at the history of government science in Canada going back to the colonial era, it kind of boils down, to oversimplify it, to two traditions. And you can almost characterize the traditions from the very first boats that were coming across the water. Samuel de Champlain hitched a ride on a boat with Sieur de Pont. Sieur de Pont was coming basically to get stuff, plunder, treasure, gold. That was why they were coming. And they found other things, beaver pelts and fish and the rest, and brought them back. Champlain was interested in, was very much a scientist of his time, as a cartographer and a naturalist, and was interested in what's here. What was this country about? Maybe it was worth building a colony, and eventually, of course, he did, and was one of the founders of Canada. And those two traditions, I describe them basically as the mercantile tradition, the giant warehouse of stuff that we have that can be made into other stuff, and still today is a very, very dominant tradition in Canadian economics and Canadian science and Canadian society. And, your natural resources are a huge engine of our economy and always have been. But then there's what I call the laboratory tradition, which you can sort of say started with Champlain. It really got a kickstart in the 1800s when Scots actually were, at the forefront of scientific research in England. Or in the United Kingdom, the best research universities were not Cambridge and Oxford for science. They were Edinburgh and Glasgow. And a lot of these Scots came and founded, things like the Geological Survey of Canada and some of the other first scientific institutions, and began this tradition of looking at the natural environment of Canada, not strictly for research purposes, but certainly for more than just plunder. And I mean, Geological Survey of Canada is a great example. They were doing what they were doing so that we could harvest resources, but they also wound up becoming one of the most important paleontology research bodies in the world, because there was lots of that stuff to look at as well. And really what we have, I think, constantly in Canadian government science anyway, is this tension between the lab and the mercantile. Do we do the esoteric stuff that's easy to make fun of, or do we do the stuff that can be applied to industry? And I think a not bad litmus test, and one that maybe not always, but mostly has predominated, is government should do what no one else is going to do. No one else is going to do generation-long data monitoring. They just aren't. That's not what university researchers do. It's not what industry does. Government, on the other hand, is terrible at short-term R&D. That's what industry does. And so the idea is not that we've never before funded and put industry first. It's just that we've never done it to the detriment as extremely of that laboratory tradition, where we're discounting the laboratory tradition. And by the way, what happens, for example, in the National Research Council is not esoteric blue sky kind of thinking. Most of it is very applied research already. And I think that's an important thing to remember. And the last point I would make is that even the stuff that's sort of esoteric, I mean, one of the arguments for shutting down or defunding the experimental lakes area, and if you listen to the government this week as they've been asked about it, you will hear from Greg Rickford, who's riding it's in and who's now the Minister for Science and Technology, he'll say, it's something that someone else would do better. It was outside the mandate of the Department of Fisheries. And this has been a long-standing argument. Didn't start with this government. The Chrétien government nearly defunded it as well. But they listened to their caucus when their caucus said, don't do this. The ELA is basic research in a sense, but it's not like David Schindler and his team went up into Northern Ontario and said, hey, I wonder what happens if a bunch of phosphorus gets thrown in the lake. Let's try it. Let's see what happens. They were responding to a massive crisis in the Great Lakes of eutrophication. There was this huge algae blooms. The lakes were in deep, deep trouble. And they made the discovery that led to worldwide regulations on phosphates. That is not esoteric research. That's exactly what government should be doing because no one else is going to do it. Whether or not it fit in very well into the DFO, and David Schindler would tell you we never fit that well into the DFO, it's something that absolutely what government should be doing. And I would argue even more so that the need for it is only getting greater. The current government is behaving as if, oh, that stuff, we don't need to be doing it anymore. I mean, one of the rationales for shutting down the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy is that thing was created before the internet when that information was not readily available. A cabinet minister made that argument. That the things that the NRTE was doing were pre-internet kind of chatty stuff that you can now do in an online forum or whatever. In this day and age, I mean, I come from a city that just saw the worst flood in its history. Never before have we needed the data as gravely. We are now into a fundamentally different era in terms of the potential impact of climate on our day-to-day lives. It's the last thing we should be doing right now is reducing the government's capacity to keep an eye on these things and hopefully inform us as to what kind of changes we need to be making to the way we live in order to survive them. And I think that's where, it's not that I suggest all of this is new, I would suggest the emphasis, the sort of routine dismissal of a lot of the sort of basic data type stuff in favor of this sort of vague notion of putting industry first and doing everything it would like, as if we aren't already doing that, by the way. As a final point, I've actually been, for reasons I won't get into, to the National Center for Upgrading Technology outside of Edmonton, which is a very large federally funded research lab that does nothing but look at ways to better upgrade bitumen into usable oil. I mean, it's not like we weren't already doing all kinds of stuff to help industry anyway. It's really, I think, a question of that emphasis. And this is a government that really would like us to take us back, I think, to a kind of 19th century mercantile tradition where let's not ask the big questions, let's not try and participate in the international dialogue about this stuff as much. Let's really stick to drawing the water and hewing the wood and doing what makes us money now.
Thanks, Chris. So Chris tells us it's a question about emphasis and also gave us concrete examples. So I think it'd be interesting to go back with really short responses from the other members of the panels. I'm not sure who wants to start. Look at Reeves or Reeves, you want to go?
Here, go. Here.
I'm okay. I don't have much to say except, I mean, in direct response to Chris, I think many in my community look back at the 19th century with fondness. And, I mean, it was the era of the gentleman scientist, right? Darwin. I mean, come on. The guy sat in his, country seat and thought about earthworms and birds and flowers. So, and without interference and with a lot of family support, by the way. So, I'm not sure if I would say hewers and wood, but I get your point. I don't think that the country has done an effective job at dealing with this debate. I think that we, as a community of people, what are we now, 38 million or so, do see ourselves as hewers of wood and drawers of wood. And we don't see ourselves as innovators. And we don't integrate that. I mean, no doubt there'll be tons of people tweeting now and saying, what are you talking about? But I think that it's popular conception that we need to change and we just work towards. I think that the economies of the future, so I currently, having stepped down from the partnership group, I now chair or co-chair an organization called the Global Young Academy, which is an organization that basically selects top flight early career researchers from around the world. We have members from over 60 countries around the world and about 155 people. And I see this in so many different ways. with my community and my colleagues in the Global Young Academy, it's people that are going to drive the economy in the future, and we have to be aware of that. And yes, there are, and I think the government is aware of that to a large extent, that they're clearly going towards where the low-hanging fruit is. That's incontrovertible, I think. So, and so we can argue and we can discuss about what's the best way to capitalize and grow the knowledge economy for the future. I think that I agree. I don't think this is an issue of discussion that in the short term, there are severe consequences to the directions for environmental health, for human health, and for our own natural resources of some of the decisions that the government has made. So that's not, to me, even a matter of discussion.
Victor or Michael?
Just a quick point. As I've been thinking about the way we framed up this debate, those who wish to be critical of the government's choices, just this evening, the distinction between the kind of science that only government can do and what industry and universities cannot became more clear to me. I think a killer argument, if you want to be critical of the current government, is that universities cannot and structurally will not, and for that matter industry either, do the long-term data collection. It's a simple statement, but I think you need to hammer that one home, because governments, that's what governments do. They're sort of semi-permanent, they're always there, they can think long-term, they always have access to funds, and that I think is not, and that's by a way of saying even the government should do basic science, if that gets you want to classify it as basic science. And it seems to me, from a rhetorical point of view, that's a killer argument that I think needs to be given. So it's not that, why do we care about the experimental lakes area? It's not because of the kind of science it was doing. It was studying fresh water. That misses the point. It was engaged in a kind of science, a gathering of data process. And there are other examples, I'm sure, that no one else can do. And that's, I think, the killer argument.
Michael, you want?
Governments almost always have access to large scale resources. It's so nice to be here and not in Washington. The weather's great too.
There's no science job.
That's true. I think science has also changed since the 19th century. We have a lot more people who are able to pursue it. They're not hitting railroad ties. They're actually able to participate in the knowledge economy. So that's something to celebrate and to talk about. I do think when we have these conversations, though, we do need to be not make this an us versus them sort of discussion. Not make it left versus right. A discussion of how how one side is doing well and one side is not. It is certainly good to draw distinctions about what particular policies and what particular practices are doing to the government scientific apparatus. But if we just keep jumping to discussions of policy, people retreat back to their corners and start yelling at each other, and that doesn't help government science. That doesn't help our cause. That doesn't help us make the case that scientific research is not a partisan issue. It's not an issue that should raise people's rankles. This is something that conservatives should support. Something that liberals should support. When we work on whistleblower protections for scientists in the U.S., we work with groups like Greenpeace, and we work with groups like the Taxpayers for Common Sense, who really want to limit government and really believe that whistleblowers will be there to expose waste, fraud, and abuse of information and abuse of science. And so you can create these transpartisan coalitions that make it easier to achieve better scientific outputs and better scientific outcomes. And so when, I really would encourage people to really choose their battles when you're going to couch it in terms that are against one party or another. That said, certainly hold people accountable for when they do censor scientists, hold people accountable for when they do withhold information, because that's the sort of way that democracy should work.
Thank you very much, Michael. So in order to, in the interest of a good Q&A session, I think what I'm suggesting now, and I'll go back to Chris, we'll go to the third question. Chris, you may want to add something on the second, but I think it's probably better to focus on the third question. Was that part of question 2? Maybe 4 minutes per person. And then right after that, we'll go directly to the audience. So how should scientific evidence be used in decision making? Key question. So 4 minutes, Chris?
All right. Well, I think this is actually gets back to Patrick's point, which I think is a good one, that what government science does, some of its most important functions, particularly in the field of the natural sciences, environmental monitoring, health standards, that sort of thing, is that basic data. And so one of the reasons we got into that was this notion, which you can trace back to Sir Robert Borden, a conservative prime minister, that we should have a civil service that is essentially really technically competent, not patronage determined, not staffed with people who are loyal to the current government, but who are just really good at the thing they do. And they should go and do it, and in the case of government science, gather the data, figure out what it means, package it up, whether it's Statistics Canada with the long-form census saying this is what we look like as a people right now, or it's various monitoring stations and research facilities saying this is what the atmospheric conditions of the high Arctic are. This is what the condition of a lake is if you keep pumping phosphorus into it, whatever. And then you take that data as basically the kind of bedrock of policy. So there are a million ways to formulate policy based on that data, but the data is, in a sense, sacrosanct. You can't pretend it's not there. You can't pretend it's open to interpretation at that sort of level. And I think that's where I take particular issue with this government, is because they've decided we are going to determine what our policy is and then cherry pick whichever data best supports it and ignore and in fact denigrate the stuff we don't like. And to move away from the environmental sciences for a minute, one of the great examples of this was the Conservative government's crime bill, which basically ignored everything that had been determined by social scientists and others gathering data over the last generation or so about what actually makes human populations safer, in favor of policy goals that were predetermined, that I would argue further actually were predetermined and calculated to win votes in certain key ridings, particularly in Southern Ontario, and then therefore pursue it and not just ignoring, but actually sneering at, being contemptuous of the people who actually have the good information. The famous quote the Prime Minister made on this most recently was, let's not commit sociology here when things happen, and that was a fun little line, but it got to the core of this government's mentality, I think, which is, hey, let's not let a bunch of eggheads tell us how things are supposed to be. So what? Whatever their numbers say, numbers can mean anything. Statistics, you can make a statistic look like anything. We know what's best. This is just trust us to do what's best for you. And I think that's where they lose, I think, a lot of us. When you're having, coming back to that Moynihan line, you're entitled to your opinions. You're entitled to your policy interpretations. You're not entitled to your own set of facts. And what's more, as a government, you should be gathering as many of those facts as you think you need to make good policy. If the data isn't already there, create some sort of body to go get it. Otherwise, at the very least, get the best data. And this idea of evidence-based policymaking, I think, in a modern 21st century democracy should be just, absolute bedrock.
Thank you very much. So we'll go to Michael, then we'll go to Patrick, and we'll finish with the scientists.
Most scientists believe that if you just provide the decision makers with all the best information, that they're going to make the right decisions. And then they get disabused of that pretty quickly, because we do live in a political system where there are other factors that go into decision making, which is the way it should be. I want to outline just kind of the fact that there are what I see as 3 different policy decisions, ways of making decisions. There's one way is you should follow the science, and the science should be the sole determination of what the policy should be. There are some things where that makes perfect sense. Drug safety. I want my prescription drugs to be determined based on their safety and effectiveness, not on whether a lobbyist paid someone a lot of money to get a meeting with them, or whether someone created an ad campaign to support that particular drug. So that is, there are areas in which science needs to trump everything else. There's the hybrids, where you come up with a scientific determination, and then you use other factors to come up with the policy response to that determination. Take air pollution. You can look at and you can make a determination of what is safe for human health. That's a scientific question. Then you can decide how to react to that determination and how to reduce pollution. Do you create incentives for businesses to reduce? Do you put punitive measures in place to make them reduce? Those are the policy questions that are guided by the scientific information. Third area is there are some policy decisions where you can recognize the evidence and ignore it. Let's take something like birth control. Let's say we have a bunch of science, which we do, that says that giving teens access to birth control lowers teen pregnancy and lowers teen STD rates. Well, if you end up, you could say, you know what, I see the evidence says that, but I still think that giving birth control to teens is morally incorrect, and I'm going to make that decision to not allow it. That's a decision that one might disagree with or one might agree with, but it's not, it's perfectly within the purview of government to make that decision based on non-scientific grounds. The point is they need to make that, they need to not say, well, the science is unsettled, well, we have this other science from this other place that wasn't peer-reviewed, that's terrible. They need to be very clear about what they do. In terms of the way that we went about solving and beginning to deal with this problem in the US, we saw it as a long game. We saw it as something where we had to have cultural change, both within society and within the federal government. And so we started by telling the story and really defining the issue, talking about what was happening, what was not happening, and collecting data, both case studies and by doing surveys of scientists and federal agencies to understand the pervasiveness of what was going on. We spent 2 years doing that, and then we spent a couple more years having conversations about what are the solutions in the US context that will make sense and will insulate science from politics. And then we spent a lot of time educating members of all parties, working with conservative and liberal allies, so that when the US election came up in 2008, that we would be well prepared, no matter who won the election, to move forward with solutions. Now, I understand you don't have the same system, you can't predict your elections like we do, or like we can, but you can still follow that same sort of approach, so I'll stop there.
All right, so Patrick.
Okay. Let me start by how I got into this. Several years ago, I was approached by some public health people, and they said, could you write us a paper on why the government doesn't do what the evidence says the government should do? And so I dutifully wrote that paper, and it's a working paper, and it will probably be the most cited thing I've ever written, because it's very popular among practitioners in public health. I wish sort of my dean would give it more credence than he does, but that's neither here nor there. But then I thought, why would you ask this question in the first place? Because for a political scientist or a social scientist, the proposition that the government would or should do what the evidence suggested is a rather odd proposition. So that's how I got into this. And let me just state it as bluntly as I can. Scientific evidence does not now, never has, nor should be the primary determinant of policy, with the exception of a couple of areas that Michael just mentioned. I'm kind of shocked and depressed by some of the rhetoric that escapes people, and we get this sort of rhetorical flourish that somehow the only good policy is evidence-based policy. I just think that idea is just amazing. It's based on a very unhelpful, indeed damaging juxtaposition, science good, politics bad. And that's a caricature of both science and politics. Politics, in this way of framing it, sometimes is reduced to ideology. And ideology is a bad thing, and we shouldn't build policy on that basis. Well, politics is a great deal more than that. Politics is not now and never has been simply about different ideological camps duking it out. And so if we're going to have an informed conversation about the role of evidence and science in the making of policy, it thinks it's absolutely essential to operate with a much more sophisticated conception of the policymaking process and of what politics is. Right now, the debate is sort of undernourished and operates with some very simple notions of how policy gets made. There are a lot of public servants in this city who spend a lot of time working on policy, and so we've developed a very elaborate, complex process. And we do so for good reasons. We do so, as I was telling my students today, because we seek, for among other things, to avoid systematic bias and systematic misinformation. We have elaborate processes to make good policy that sometimes have very little to do, or only a little bit to do, with creating a science base or an evidence base. To summarize sort of my general theme is politics and the making of public policy. Politics is not about ideology, it's about a careful and judicious balancing between evidence, public opinion, economic growth, environmental protection, human rights, national security, and any number of other factors you want to name. And the art of politics is the judicious balancing of those things. One group of politicians will strike that balance different than a different group of politicians. It doesn't make one right and the other wrong. It just makes, they come to a determination that this is the balance they're going to strike. And if we don't like it, eventually we get a different group of politicians. But these broad claims of right and wrong are not helpful.
Right, so, Reese.
Last word goes to the scientist. It's actually a good segue, I think, to what I was thinking about saying. I think it's, as a scientist, I see, we love, many of my colleagues love to have these discussions and where we actually take evidence to almost perverse endpoints, right? So, well, if you're going to do this, then, if you believe this, then you absolutely have to do this. I mean, and I think in a public policy context, the best idea that speaks to me is eugenics. I mean, yeah, if you want to get rid of diseases that are caused by what we would consider deleterious mutations that decrease our health and well-being, well, you know what? One way to do that is to prevent some people from breeding. Sorry, that's a biological term, from having a family. That is absolutely perverse. And I don't need to point to, the consequences of that, I think. But I actually don't want to talk about that so much as to say that I think that it is imperative that evidence inform policy. And I actually have quite a lot of confidence in many of our public servants that that is happening. And it is the prerogative of the government in power to use that evidence in the way that they decide to do. Now, if you are concerned about the way this government or future governments in this country are using that evidence, then I think there are some concrete things that we can do. One is, there is a clear lack of receptivity in this government, as well as many other Western governments around the world, to the notions of science and evidence and some aspects of that. And the data that I point to on this is, I once sat down in my office and looked on the Parle Info website and tried to counted up. You can search all the CVs of all the MPs in the House of Commons. How many had a first degree, a bachelor's level degree in science, engineering, or health sciences, including chiropractic. Being generous here. Turns out there are 17 out of a total of 308 sitting members of Parliament. How many would you, is that a high or low number? It's hard to know. But if you use university graduation rates in the same fields as a guide, you would expect to see 98 out of 308. So close to 100. That to me says there's a clear, lack of receptivity in, at least to begin with, that there are many of our representatives that we elect. They may be strong in other areas, but they're not necessarily attuned to incorporating the information that science or evidence is giving them. Now, at the same token, you can't do the same kind of analysis with scientists and how many are attuned and receptive to political life. But I can tell you from experience that the vast majority are not. And I think that is the crucial place where we need to work. I think I'll come back to the partnership group. One of the programs that the partnership group runs is called Bacon and Eggheads, which is a breakfast seminar series on Parliament Hill, where we invite parliamentarians to hear from top-flight Canadian researchers that are speaking on the science behind topical issues. They do get coached, by the way, so that they make sure that they don't advocate or lobby on behalf of any particular organization. And you know what? This is an incredibly, I think, an incredibly successful program. And one of the reasons it's successful is it actually has very little to do with what the scientist actually says. It has a lot to do with the fact that before and after the presentation, there's a lot of mingling. There's a lot of meeting and shaking hands and schmoozing, as we like to say. And it's because that's where trust is built, when you actually get to talk to somebody. I think the AAAS Fellows Program in the United States is a phenomenal program, where you can take PhD graduates and place them on Capitol Hill in a policy shop for a year or 2 years. I think we need something like that. There are a whole bunch of other ideas that could go on about it. But I think building trust in these two communities and sharing experiences is really, really valuable. And I can tell you, as a fairly young-ish still scientist, when I've talked about these sorts of programs to other young people around the country, I get a lineup of them who are keen on these sorts of things. And I think that's where we need to work to prepare some of the perceived damages. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Rees. So there is over 100 persons, I think, in the audience that have been waiting for question period. So we're going to start with one here, and then we have one in the back, and then we have one in here again.
Question period, my favorite. My name is Bruce Heyer, and Rees handed me a segue in that I'm one of those 17. I'm a former scientist and evolutionary biologist, actually, who got talked into running for politics. Jack Layton assured me I would not win, but accidents happen. And so I'm now one of the 2 voluntarily independent members of Parliament. Evidence for Democracy is a great name, it's a great organization, and we've talked a lot about the evidence side of it tonight. We haven't talked at all about the democracy side of it. Yes, it's a problem that only 17 MPs have science backgrounds at all, but there's a far greater problem. A man named Pierre Trudeau in 1970 changed our Elections Act so that you can't run for any party, unless the national leader signs your nomination papers. And so now we not only have the muzzling of scientists, we have the muzzling of our democratic representatives. There are very few members of Parliament who dare stand up to their parties. They're not allowed to, and trust me, they get dragged into a back room and said, if you don't behave, we won't sign your nomination papers. So I know it's expanding the issue hugely, and it's probably a topic for another night, which I'm sure that Chris Turner could get really motivated on, and maybe others. But I'm hopeful to get a little bit of comment on that huge democratic problem in Canada, which is one of the most draconian party-controlled countries on the planet.
What we'll do, I think we'll take 3 or 4 questions, and then the panel could decide which question. So there's a question here, question there, sir, right after, and then question here. Okay. Yes.
I guess I should just check my voice. Hello, my name is Matt McMahon. I'm an inventor, and among many other things. I personally do have issues with the way how I see science affecting our environment, and I feel that I'm not used to this many people looking at me. Yes, please, everyone turn around. I feel that economics should never get in the way of our environment, and our environment should always come first. And you know, it is very apparent to most people that corporations are sort of running the world now, and money should never be the reason that our environments are being destroyed for whatever resources they may bring. And you know, do not create a problem unless you already have the solution.
Thank you. So we have 2 more questions we'll take for now.
Thank you. Peter Crawls, my name. quick question. At what point does the muzzling of scientists and science information become a problem for the federal government with respect to legal challenges in the sense of ability of the federal government to discharge its fiduciary responsibility on the health and safety of Canadians? Thank you.
And one more.
My name is Mark Sarner. I'm the director of the Institute for Science, Society and Policy on campus. First, I want to say that I thought it was a really great panel. I think you actually did address the questions, which is not always the case. You did it in a really complete way, so congratulations on that. It gives me an occasion to actually crank up the questions a bit deeper and go beyond the questions you have. Beyond censorship, I would like to know a bit more about self-censorship. I actually was a public servant, a scientist in government for 5 years. So I'm curious what your view is, also from the US. Is it possible to describe or even measure the level of self-censorship in different places, in different governments? And what is your view on is that actually an issue that we should discuss or not?
Thank you very much. So we'll ask each member of the panel to pick which question they want to answer, and then we'll go for a second round. So for those who haven't had a chance yet, we'll come back. So Chris, you want to start, I think?
Sure, yeah. I'll begin with Bruce Heyer's question. And it's an obvious one for me because as some of you in the room probably know, in addition to being a journalist, I also was the Green Party candidate in the Calgary Centre by-election last year, and certainly learned a whole lot about how that process works. If that in any way biases you about the book or anything, I will point out I was writing the book before I decided to run for Parliament, and I was and remained a journalist for 15 years, and I was only a candidate for a couple months. So just bear that in mind as reading. But I think this is an important question. It is not just that scientists are not speaking out. It's that government generally, Parliament generally, has become an extraordinarily poor place to discuss the issues of our time. And I think that is a really critical thing to keep in mind. This was not always the case. Again, it's not wholly new, but the emphasis has changed a lot. And it's not just, by the way, the Conservative government. All of the three major parties function almost exclusively by whipped vote, which means there's absolutely no dissension. There's very few free votes. All of them use talking points in question period and beyond. All of them, there's not a backbench MP for any of the three major parties that feels free to speak to their constituents and their own conscience if it goes against what the parties decided to take a stand on. So that's an enormous crisis, and I think a huge problem. And among other things, it's created this notion of warring factions. And really what's supposed to happen is they're supposed to war once every few years when the government's dissolved, and then get down to the business of running the country as good as effectively as possible. And an example I discuss in the book that I think will sound amazing, given that it's not that long ago, is the issue of climate change. The Canadian government under Brian Mulroney in the late 1980s was miles ahead of where that conversation is now, at a time when the science was much more uncertain, brand new, really confusing. We actually had a mature, effective discussion about how Canada was going to respond, and led that conversation internationally. And you talk to scientists who were involved at the time, and I did, and they will tell you, when we went to Geneva for the big climate conference, all three parties sent people. And they sat together and talked as representatives of the government of Canada about how Canada should respond, not as representatives of three political parties about how to gain advantage out of this policy decision. And I think that loss of civility, of basic respect and trust is damaging wherever you are on the political spectrum, is damaging to the country.
Thank you. Michael, you want to talk about some of the issues?
Sure. Briefly, to the question in the back, yes, corporations have a significant influence over how science is done, and sometimes engage significantly in trying to manipulate and suppress and distort information. We did a study, report is called Heads They Win, Tails We Lose. It's on the Union of Concerned Scientists website, just Google that and you'll find it. And it kind of details a lot of the different ways that corporations can influence how the government uses science, everything from influencing scientific advisory committees to intimidating scientists. So check that out. I think it's a good primer for that information. The U.S. problem in terms of science, or in terms of representatives being able to speak openly and buck their party, has the two different things. First is the way that districts are drawn for representatives districts is political and partisan in many states. And if the Republicans are in power, they'll draw them to favor themselves. Vice versa for the Democrats. This creates districts where extremists can win more easily, and where the party is more able to put a primary challenger against you if you are to buck the party line. Same thing with money in politics in the U.S. It's a growing problem, and it reduces the ability of members of Congress to be able to speak openly. The self-censorship question is a great question, and it's one that is very hard to measure. One of the reasons why I don't think it would work here to just kind of pull back the policies that are kind of restricting scientist speech is that there has to be clarity, and there has to be some sort of policies that are proactive that tell scientists what they can do. Because if they don't know where the line is, they're going to stand way back from it, and they're not going to communicate, and they're not going to engage. And so we just need, we need to take care of that. The other question, the other problem that's related to self-censorship is brain drain. A lot of scientists want to be able to do their jobs, they want to be able to do their research. And in the US, when there was a lot of problems, scientists were getting fed up, and they were leaving. And the same thing threatens to happen right now in terms of the government shutdowns, that scientists who are losing data, who are losing information, they'll flee the government. They'll say this isn't worth it, and we need our best and brightest in federal service.
It just reminds me that a couple of years ago, see Scott Finley up in the front, my department had a job search for a field biologist. And this was at the time when the writing was on the wall for many Environment Canada's scientists. And we had close to 200 applications for one position. Not an insignificant number of those were from scientists in Environment Canada. I don't remember the exact number. I'd like to say, to sort of meld the comments by Bruce and by Mark on the issue, because I think they're exactly the same thing. I have no idea, Mark, how to measure self-censorship, but I think that self-selecting oneself out of these discussions is a huge problem on both sides, as you point out, Bruce. I mean, you've obviously crossed the floor, if you like, and I applaud you for doing that, because I think there's so few people who are, so few scientists who are ready to basically reach down and pick up the muck and start flinging it across the floor of the House of Commons. It's just not mostly in our nature. We don't like it. It's why we go into science. We don't want to do that. We in many ways absolve ourselves of the responsibility by saying, well, my skills are best used at the lab bench. At the same time, no doubt there are many people in politics who've run for office, maybe because they couldn't do calculus, physics, and chemistry. I don't know. I mean, that's why I went to biology. I think those issues are real. Self-selecting oneself out of the discussion, and so we need to work more effectively at bringing those and find new ways to bring those two communities back together. That's because it's a real problem, and it's not just a problem in Canada, by the way. There was a series of articles in The Guardian from the UK over the last summer. There's one PhD scientist in the UK Parliament of about 600 seats. I don't know the numbers on first degrees, but David Adam, I think, was the one who wrote the series of pieces. Very worth reading.
Okay, I'm going to take my courage in my hands and try and address the question that's heretofore been avoided about at what point does the government's, I'll paraphrase the question, correct me if I get it wrong, lack of investment in its science risk the government respecting its fiduciary duty? That's a tricky one. Here, there is a difference between Canada and the United States. And I'm not sufficiently trained in the law to articulate it clearly, but I'll give it my best shot. In Canada, we don't, among other things, we don't have the litigation tradition they have in the United States. So there are cases that are brought in the US courts where a claim is made, the government has a responsibility to do X, the government has not done X, and therefore I'm going to use the courts to try and force the government to do what is fiduciary duty. In Canada, we don't have the same kind of legal tradition, and so we do less of that, I guess is the first way of answering the question. The second way of answering the question is to say, let's take a concrete example, Vioxx, right? So we have a drug, turns out to not be safe, turns out that people are injured and die as a result of it. It's very difficult to show, as a matter of law, that the government failed in its duty. That's setting the bar incredibly high. So yes, there is a fiduciary duty, but if the couple of cases I can bring to mind quickly are any indication, it takes a long time to get to that level of saying the government actually failed. And then I guess the final thing I'd say is government gets to rewrite the rules. So you can just lower your obligations if you think that you're not going to be able to meet them. Let me just make a quick point on self-censorship. Yes, self-censorship I'm sure is a problem, but what we teach our students, at least in my program, is to work for the government is to try and uphold the tradition of speaking truth to power. And as difficult as that may sometimes be, and we take that that proposition very, very seriously. And I can tell you from first-hand experience, there is a lot of truth being spoken to power in government as we speak, and has been for a long time. The problem is we don't see it, and that's the way the system is designed. We don't actually get to see the kind of advice that public servants, senior public servants in particular, provide to their political masters. But I can assure you that there is more frank talk and use of science than we might actually otherwise expect. The problem is, I think the measuring part is just, it bedevils me. It would be very, very difficult to know. So the situation is bad, but maybe not as bad as we might think.
Thank you very much. So we have time for 3 short questions. Then I will ask the panelists to then answer those questions they want to answer, and also to sum up in terms of what they would like to leave us with. So we have a question here, we have a question there, we have a question in the back. Okay, so Madame.
Oh, thank you. Speaking of self-censorship, I got out my phone this week and didn't. But my question really is for Chris. Speaking of evidence and science, there are psychological methods around framing a question. And by using the term war, and I think some of the panelists addressed this, by using the term war, you are evoking messages back about being enemies, right? But we're Canadians. We're here to work together on this. So I want to ask if you understood that risk when you took it, because of course the war message is more powerful, perhaps financially. But could you speak to the implications of the decision you made?
All right, so that obviously a question that will be answered by Chris. Okay, we have another question here.
My name is Jonathan Lovis. I spent 10 years working in a knowledge brokering organization. Preceding that was 20 years working at the university as an applied health service researcher, trying to avoid being a real academic, which Webster's dictionary definition says of no practical value. And the last 5 years in retirement working in 3 different governments. So I have different perspectives. The most striking thing that came out of the panel for me was a call that I've heard many times before, and I think we really need to pay a lot more attention to, which is the perceptive capacity for evidence and the ability of governments, the media, the public, anyone, to understand some of the fundamental rules of science. Otherwise, we just have people arguing, saying this is true and that's true. In trying to get there, however, we have a big challenge. Whenever I talk to university researchers, you use the word evidence, they say, oh yes, a research study which is validated, etc., etc. You talk to a politician, a member of the public, or a member of the media, and say, what's evidence? The politician might say what my constituents think. The media might say what my editor wants me to write about, and a general member of the public will often just say whatever happens to be today's facts that people are asserting. These are totally different concepts of evidence. How are we ever going to get to science literacy when researchers have one concept of evidence and everybody else seems to be operating on a totally different concept of what is evidence?
Thank you very much. And we have the last question here in the back.
Hi, I have a question to the panelists.
I'd like to see what you think about this. My name is Simon Pierre Demers. I was a panel organizer last year at the Canadian Science Policy Conference. Fundamental research as a driver of innovation. And so there was consensus on 2 points that came out of the panel discussion there. One of them was that graduate student training needs to be revamped. And this comes back to one of the points that was mentioned on the panel. But more importantly, there was consensus on the fact that both innovation and fundamental research need to be funded. However, my question to you is, what happens when budgets for, say, the overall budget includes a reallocation that is earmarked for innovation? So given the limited amounts of money that there exists for fundamental research, what happens when a part of that money is used and earmarked for innovation, when both should be funded?
Well, thank you very much. So we'll just go down, and again, I think we'll ask also the panelists to wrap up at the same time. So maybe we'll start with Patrick this side, and then we'll finish with Chris.
So let me react to Jonathan's question or point about receptivity and the different conceptions of evidence. One thing I think that is a bad idea, and I see this a lot in a lot of conversations, is that when you tell a scientist that scientific evidence is not the only thing, there is a sort of strategic device which is to say, well, no, actually, I want to privilege the role of evidence, so I will make a larger and larger class of things evidence. So public opinion becomes evidence, and I think that strategy is wrong. I think we should call scientific evidence, reserve the word evidence for things that science brings us in the normal way, and use the words we already have. Call it public opinion, call it what my constituents think, call it the values that I hold dear, and don't try and subsume that under this overarching concept of evidence as a way of trying to privilege or give special place to evidence-based policy. Just as a summing up remark, I would just go back to the sort of the point I made earlier, which is, if this conversation is going to go forward and in a useful way, 2 basic points. One, that the sort of really simple dichotomy, science good, politics bad, is just not the way to go, and it's not a good idea. And second, and here I'll make I'll make a plea for my own discipline. It strikes me that when we talk about evidence and democracy, there are actually social scientists in general and political scientists in particular, we spend our lives worrying and thinking about actually how policy gets made. And so it strikes me that we have systematic attempts to try and think about how policy gets made, including the role that evidence does and does not play. And so the debate could and should be enriched by drawing on what we do know that's in the public debate as to how policy gets made, and I think we'll end up with a richer conversation.
Yeah, I guess I can take up the issue of earmarking monies for innovation. It's absolutely true that if you look at the answer allocations to different sources of grant funding over the last little while, since the time I started as an independent researcher, the amount going to so-called innovation-based or targeted funding has certainly increased. What the right balance is, I don't have a good answer. Is it 30%, 70%? Is it 50-50? Is it 70-30? If you ask people in my discipline, they will, if you ask any scientist working outside of government, they will say, and you ask them, what do you need? More money, more time. Well, that's not very useful, right? I mean, you got to go beyond that. So it's a conversation that has to happen, and I think that there are better ways of having it. So basic research is absolutely important, but so also is innovation-based research, and the two should feed off of each other. As a summing up, of course, this is the one part I didn't really prepare. But I think that I would say that to me, the gap that I perceive most strongly is that scientists, on the one hand, scientists themselves this is one of the first times, at least in my limited perception of what's going on, is that they've really started to engage in these conversations, and I think that's a good thing. There are other opportunities around the world where science is being given an opportunity to have a clearer and stronger voice in multi-stakeholder discussions. I'm thinking about, I have a little bit of experience with the World Economic Forum, and that's one place where it's happening, as an example. That's rather a new idea, I think, in some respects. That can you seat on a stage a scientist next to a prime minister, next to a CEO of a large multinational, and the executive director of an NGO, a large NGO, international NGO, and have that scientist actually have something important to say. I think you can, but it's not a role that scientists have traditionally played. And I think they need to start growing up a little bit and recognize that they are playing politics. At the same time, I think there's a lot that the public and the publics, whether it's the elected representatives we talk about, whether it's the broader public that we are all a part of, can do to become a little bit more sensitized to the way in which scientists think. And that scientists it's an incumbent on scientists to start doing that job, and that's where the issue of engagement comes in. So I'll leave you with that.
Thank you. Michael?
Should graduate student training change? Yes, and it will, and it is already, and that is because I need more money, I need more time, people are going away, because the younger generation is really interested in engaging. There's a generational shift. It's very interesting. I think that you asked a question sort of about science literacy and using terms like evidence. I think what's actually more important is civic literacy. If we understand how science is used and misused, we don't really have to get into the details and the nitty-gritty of the scientific method and everything else, and it's not a realistic sort of expectation that people are going to make that investment. So if we do invest more in civic literacy, I think we're better off. Final comments, I was actually really impressed when I talked about our previous report. It was tweeted out by somebody in the crowd almost immediately, so that was really cool. He's waving his hand over there. Thank you. So maybe more people will do that with the other resources I mentioned. I brought a couple of different reports that we have done. One is Federal Science for the Public Good, is the greenish one. That is our sort of summary of how we wanted to fix the US system when it came to scientific integrity. Pick it up if you want to read it online if you prefer screens to paper. There's also a guide for scientists who do find themselves in the public eye to figure out what to respond to. We call it Science in an Age of Scrutiny, a guide for scientists to respond to harassment while they are also being responsible citizens. Read up on that if you're a scientist and find that at some point your research may be considered contentious, or if you want to figure out how to better engage. We also, at the Union of Concerned Scientists, have a science network that anyone can join. We do come up here and we talk to Canadian scientists. We don't have chapters here or anything like that, but we do provide webinars and other things that help scientists be better scientist citizens. I wanted to close because I think with a quote from Martin Luther King, which I blogged about when we had the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, which I think speaks to some of the what we talked about today in regard to the need for to be able to adopt pluralistic worldviews and discussions. He said in one of his more famous sermons, something about science. Science investigates, religion interprets. Science gives man knowledge, which is power. Religion gives man wisdom, which is control. Science deals mainly with facts. Religion deals mainly with values. The two are not rivals. They're complementary. Science keeps religion from sinking into the valley of crippling irrationalism and paralyzing obscurantism. Religion prevents science from falling into the marsh of obsolete materialism and moral nihilism. We can approach problems from different perspectives and different ways, and we need to remember that. Thanks for having me here. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you very much, Michael. So last word for the author of The War on Science, Chris Turner. So and we also have many copies here. You don't have to go on Amazon. So, Chris.
First of all, very hard to follow a Martin Luther King quote. Just take a break for a moment and let that sink over. First of all, thank you very much to my fellow panelists and to Evidence for Democracy and everyone else for setting this up. I really, really appreciate it. It's been, a tremendously engaging conversation to start the launch of this book, and I hope it's a sign of things to come. I'll talk a little bit about the receptive capacity thing and then close with why the book's called The War on Science, and that'll serve, it leads into why I wrote it and where my motivation comes from. And part of it is, in fact, to hopefully inspire some serious discussion around this, and we're already well on our way. First of all, the receptive capacity for evidence is something that as a journalist has obsessed me off and on, more on than off, for most of the last 10 years. And that's mainly because my sort of beat as a journalist has mainly been looking at climate change and our collective response to it. And it has been a case study for longer than I've been looking at it in the limits of our capacity to understand scientific evidence and what it means. And this is for all kinds of reasons that we could spend a whole other night talking about. The miscommunication, the misunderstanding. You could pick any single point, and you would just see a whole kind of constellation of limits to individually and collectively our ability to respond to what evidence is sometimes telling us. And if you're interested in that kind of thing, a great place to start would be something like Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which looks at the fact that even the most sort of rational and logical of us frequently are being driven, at least somewhat, by irrationalities and biases and all kinds of limits to our receptive capacity. But the thing I would point out, I feel like I spend an enormous amount of my time arguing, discussing, and hopefully informing about what scientists mean when they say uncertainty, and what politicians and business people and various other people who would rather not do anything particularly drastic on the subject of climate change mean when they say uncertainty. It's the biggest gap I know of as a journalist and just as a person on the earth, is the distance between what scientists talk about, climate scientists, when they get together to discuss climate science, and what the general public and the media and politicians think goes on in those discussions. It is staggering, the distance. The uncertainty, finally in this new IPCC report, I think they did the job well. There was some sort of communication that came out around it that pointed out that the degree of uncertainty around climate change is roughly similar to the degree of uncertainty around the healthiness of vitamins. We're not 100% sure how much and which ones, but we know vitamins are good for you. And we're not entirely sure how much and which ones and the rest of it, but we know that climate change is happening and we're causing it, and it has severely dire consequences for human populations. And that's really a huge part of what I've tried to do as a journalist is make that clear, and then make clear that there are really great solutions already being developed. Which brings us to why I wrote a book called The War on Science, and why it's called The War on Science. There's an obvious kind of practical reason for it, which is, of course, that if you walk by a bookshelf and you see a book called Science in Canada, funded by the government, is starting to change a bit in ways that are a little bit into the unprecedented, you're past it before you've stopped. Whereas if it's called The War on Science, it grabs your attention, it says, pay attention to me, this is heavy, let's talk. And that's really the, fundamentally, it is, the book cover is essentially an advertisement for the book. The phrase was already being used, and that's something you like to try and do as a journalist and a writer, is to pick up on a phrase that already has resonance, so that, when people see it, they recognize it, and, oh, I've heard about that. And so that's the really practical reason. But the larger reason why the book was written, and why it takes a pretty strident tone, and perhaps even an entertaining rant of a tone, is because, as I said, I honestly believe, and I think the evidence is mounting, that the defining public policy issue of the 21st century is how we respond to climate change. If you strip away everything else this government has done and just look at how it has responded to the challenge of climate change, it represents, to my mind, a profound and unforgivable recklessness. And that really is what motivates me to try and drive this conversation as hard as possible, to provoke rather than simply to maybe begin by meeting halfway, is because the amount of contempt and recklessness for what we know is happening by this government is so far beyond the pale that I think that, maybe we do need a little bit of shock into reality. It is extraordinary. I spend a lot of my time researching really amazing, innovative responses to climate change in places like Northern Europe and even in parts of Canada. But certainly when you go to those places, it would be comical if it weren't so serious how trite our conversation is around the gravity of these issues. I mean, it's just extraordinary that in the House of Commons it's been reduced to shouting epithets across the aisle about job-killing carbon taxes and the rest of it. It's unbelievably irresponsible. And so that's why I phrased the title as firmly as I did, was to try and shout above that noise and say, hey, wait a second, we need to agree on the facts here and proceed from them if we intend to actually, prepare this country for what's coming.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Some of the comments by Chris give me the opportunity to mention one course that will be offered, an intensive course at the law school in January, and it's about scientific evidence and legal evidence, which is, so how you look at legal evidence versus scientific evidence. So, and that will be a 42-hour intensive course. So that's a good issue. So, I think that, I invite you to thank our panelists. Thank you very much, and Katie will close the session.
Well, first I want to thank you all for bearing with us as we ran a little bit over time. I think it was worth it. And thanks again to the panelists. I feel like, for me, it was refreshing to move beyond the talking points on these issues and actually be able to dig into them deeper. And I do feel like we raised the bar on the discourse on these issues tonight, which is a really good thing. And so I would also like to let you know we have copies of The War on Science available for purchase outside for $20, and Chris will be out there to sign them as well for you. And if you enjoyed the event this evening, I would also like to invite you to consider making a contribution to Evidence for Democracy. And thank you all so much for coming. Thank you.
Oh, come on. It's already I made myself quite obvious.
It was in the next year.